You're not going to believe this, but sometimes YouTube camera reviewers don't agree with each other. Why is this? The answer is obvious. I'm smart, the other one is stupid. This is not really the case. But I do want to go over the various list of reasons why two different reviews will disagree, because this came up with the Sony a7C that we just reviewed, because like we found all these problems with the video AF and other people didn't find those problems. And I'm also going to address past reviews like the A9 EVF lag and the Sony Z6 various problems that we found. First, I want to say, in all these circumstances, what you're going to see is both the reviewers are right. The sort of disagreements that people manufacture can mostly be explained away. One of the most common problems I see is they say user error. Like they specifically said your A7C video AF didn't work because of user error. You clearly had it set to the super slow setting instead of the regular fast setting. By the way, definitely not the case. I went and double checked. It was set at the most responsive, the very highest setting, which is also the default setting. And we actually did a whole podcast called Stop Saying RTFM. Stop saying read the FN manual, because it's kind of silly to say user error in the age of 2020. Like these are generalized consumer electronic cameras and they should work in their best situations by default. And if they don't work by default, then they should be helping the user figure out circumstances where they need to change. But at the same time, as reviewers, we do have some responsibility to follow up with the camera manufacturers and figure out what the optimal settings are and to test different conditions. And by the way, we always do that. Anytime we have a problem that we think might be fixable, we reach out to the manufacturer and say, hey, I'm having these problems. And sometimes they don't get back to us. Sometimes they can't get back to us. But we personally always make that point of reaching out. So in these circumstances, often there's a situation where a non-default setting produces better results. And one thing I can think of is the Fujifilm X-T1 review. This is the very first X-T1 just after it was released with the version 1.0 firmware. We did an autofocus test against an Olympus mirrorless camera, and we found that the Olympus mirrorless camera was just way better at autofocus than the Fuji. And the Fuji people were outraged because there was a very hidden setting under power saver. You had to go in under power saver and turn that off. And then that would drastically improve the video, the autofocus, stills and video. But the setting itself didn't say anything about autofocus, and the user manual didn't say it was related to autofocus. It was just whether power saving was on or off, and it was on by default. So we actually took this feedback, we changed the setting, and we did a whole retest, and we ended up taking down the original review. But this is absurd. And as proof of that, Fuji actually, in later generations, changed that user interface. They later called it boost mode, and then eventually got turned on by default so that the default settings would work. And that's kind of the way things should work. You know, we were open to feedback, and we tested it a different way. When we discovered that a camera setting change could improve the results, we integrated that into the free tutorial that we have at sdp.io/tutorials. And then Fuji went and corrected it in the long term. That's kind of best case scenario. But when you look back at all the criticism we received for the X-T1 review, most of it really isn't justified, especially sort of the harshness of it. One of the most common complaints I see is that, oh, you're clearly sponsored. You're saying this negative thing about the Sony a7C because now you're sponsored by Canon. Or when we didn't like the Canon cameras, we were sponsored by Sony or Nikon or something like this. This is a very serious accusation that you're throwing around. It's libel. And when I say libel, I don't mean to say I'm going to sue you. It's L-I-B-E-L. It's the written form of slander. You're accusing me or some other reviewer of a crime. It is a crime to accept a sponsorship and not disclose it. And we are really careful to disclose every single sponsorship that we get. And our integrity and reputation are built on that. So you can't go telling people that we accepted a sponsorship and did not disclose it. It's illegal, unethical, and generally awful. But at the same time, there are a lot of YouTubers and other reviewers on other platforms that do accept sponsorships. Generally, they fully disclose this, but they do not always fully disclose it. So I totally get the skepticism, and I think it's good to ask. If somebody issues a glowing review about any camera, like go look that person up and see if they might be an ambassador. Because quite often when somebody says to me, hey, you gave this camera a poor review, so-and-so says it's perfect in every way, I go and I look that person up and they are an ambassador for that company. Often they start the video out by saying, I'm an ambassador for this company, but the people consuming the review either gloss over that or just don't care, perhaps because they're specifically seeking out reviews that agree with the decision they've already made to buy the camera, or that they like that company or something. So be aware, some people actually are sponsored, some people don't properly disclose it, but it's not okay to go accusing everybody of being sponsored just because they don't agree with a different reviewer. A slightly less severe form of this is accusing people of having some kind of bias. You're not being paid, but for some reason you seem to have bias for one company or another. And this is impossible to prove or disprove because none of us are actually fully aware of all the different types of bias that we have. You might like somebody at the company, or maybe you have a fond feeling for a particular brand, and that could lead you to slightly overlook some flaws or accentuate other flaws. It might make you put a little more time and research into solving a particular problem, when for a different company you might just go out and just blast everybody with that problem. It could change the way you write the title or thumbnail to be more positive or more negative. I can't say I have no bias, but we strive to be aware of our own biases and factor that in. Nobody can. But at the same time, when I've dug into the people accusing me of bias, I often find that they're actually fanboys, that they actually themselves have some sort of bias. And I do think when people throw around accusations that they often start with projecting. They start with the crimes that they themselves are guilty of. So if you feel that little tingling inside yourself that makes you mad just because somebody said something negative or positive about a company that you dislike, you might just want to check that and take a breath before you go throwing out any new accusations. One of the most common problems is firmware version. Firmware is continuously updated, and if you watch reviews from different points in time, you could see very different results. This has happened over and over again. Like if you were to go back and watch our original XT1 review now, it would seem absurd because it was done on firmware version 1.0. And I don't know what the version they went up to, like 5 or 6. They went through so many different revisions. Like, congrats, Fuji. That's great. But when companies are continuously releasing firmware updates, it sort of invalidates parts or all of every preceding review, and that makes it frustrating as both a reviewer and a consumer of reviews, because you never really know whether something is current and up to date. This happened recently with the Canon R5 and R6. Basically every reviewer on the planet put a bunch of energy into testing the overheating, and then a week later Canon released firmware updates that changed that. And that means that all the time that we put in was completely wasted. And by the way, I've been shooting with both the R5 and the R6 vlog style, and since the firmware updates, I have not had either one overheat in my real world shooting, whereas before, they both overheated 100% of the time. So this firmware update that just came out a couple of weeks ago just pretty drastically changed our recommendations for those cameras, and we are working on a new revision to that review. But what happens when they release a firmware update like a week later? It actually gets really tough to keep track of. Another common complaint is that, oh, this lens isn't sharp, but everybody else said it was sharp because you must have a bad copy. To some extent, this can actually be true, especially manufacturers with poor levels of quality control, quality assurance. One copy can be drastically better or worse than another. Lens Rentals is a great company for looking at these sorts of variations because they often buy 20, 30 lenses, and they'll go through and test each and every one of them. And they might see one particular brand, they're all basically identical, like they have great quality control. But then often with like the third-party brands, they have one great copy and then one terrible copy, and then one is like completely off center. So naturally, as a reviewer, if you review only one copy of something, you're reviewing that copy. And that doesn't sound fair, right? Because somebody else might get a copy that outperforms or underperforms that. You're right, it's not fair, but it's also the only practical thing we can do. Like, what am I gonna do? Like review 30 copies of it? Like, I don't, that's boring. I just don't wanna do that. Variations also happen in things like camera bodies, like slight differences in the way something is built can mean things align better or worse. It doesn't happen that much. Like, you don't need to be throwing that out every time two reviewers disagree. There's probably a different way to explain it. Another reason two reviews disagree is that they were measured at different extremes. For example, we tend to test autofocus in situations where it would be obvious if the autofocus was missed. And to me, that means shooting wide open with a fast lens. In our background, we were portrait and wedding photographers as well as commercial photographers, and we often relied on shallow depth of field to blur out the background. That is a much harder task for the autofocus system to perform under than shooting at f5.6 or f8 with lots and lots of depth of field. So we like to test it at its extreme. If you asked me to test a Porsche 911, I would punch it. I would put the gas all the way down. I might take it to a track. I think other people might just take it to the local convenience store and see how it did in stop and go traffic. It's okay. There's value in both types of reviews, but not everybody pushes equipment to the same extremes that we do. Conversely, maybe other people push it to a greater extreme than we do in some circumstances. But quite often we push stuff to the point of failure, especially in side-by-side comparisons, because it's not that I think everybody is going to always use that. It's that I think somebody at one point might need that and they should understand how it's going to perform. Our recommendations are always, hey, this works or doesn't work under these circumstances. It's not a buy or don't buy recommendation. It is simply, you can decide for yourselves whether you're willing to accept the weaknesses or whether it's strong enough for you to use. I also want to say, especially with autofocus tests, you need to ask yourself if you would be able to spot a failure in the autofocus test. Especially when I look at camera autofocus tests for stills, I often see that the subject is so far away, so small in the frame, that even if they were to move forward or back without the focus changing, you wouldn't notice that they were out of focus. The testers often don't zoom in really, really close. When we are testing something for autofocus, we will often use like an 85 f1.4 and do a tight headshot because we want to see the difference between focusing on the eyelashes or focusing on the eye. That's how extreme we get. I do see tests where it's a sports test and the subject is so small in the frame that they could run 5 yards forward and the camera might completely misfocus, but you wouldn't be able to see it. One way to check this is, well, do you zoom in all the way? You actually you find one really sharp shot and you compare the other shots against it to see if the other shots are less sharp. That's how we typically do our autofocus testing. We're very extreme about counting the precision because that's how we are able to distinguish between the best performers and the worst performers. Not everybody is like that. So if you see somebody running side to side in the frame and you don't see the background changing, then the camera's not doing any focusing, and this is not actually providing you any information about the performance of the autofocus system. Another common concern of people is that we tested a pre-production camera, and thus any flaws that we found can be blamed on this pre-production. Now, this is something that the manufacturers actually seem to use to dismiss problems that reviewers have. Many times, we've been handed gear, told it was production, and then we find a flaw, and suddenly the manufacturer says, oh, yeah, that flaw, your camera's production, but that flaw is actually a pre-production thing, so you shouldn't mention it because the actual buyers of the camera are never going to experience that, so therefore it's completely irrelevant. This is so frustrating to me as a camera reviewer because I am actually tasked with finding every problem that the buyers might encounter so they can see the potential problems and assess it before they put down their hard-earned money. And to actually find a problem and then have the manufacturer just summarily dismiss it, it makes me feel like, what's the point of trying to flesh these things out? And even though we sort of set down this hard rule where we won't accept pre-production gear anymore, I've still accepted what's branded production gear and then later found out that it was pre-production gear. For example, our entire A7R4 review, we went to New York City at a press event. We had to scrap the whole thing. We did not produce a video. We wasted an entire weekend doing that because Chelsea and I both got copies of the camera that seemed to just continuously miss eye autofocus. And all the tests that were set up were for portraits that would be using eye autofocus, and thus we gathered absolutely no useful data. It turns out that my production A7R4 sitting there does not have that problem. Indeed, it was actually a pre-production problem that affected multiple cameras, not just ours, but other people's cameras too. So manufacturers often need to get these cameras out to people ahead of time, and that means that even if it's a production camera, it might be assembled by hand, and thus during that hand assembly, things might not get lined up quite right, or the firmware might not be completely final, even though it's labeled 1.0. This has happened with many different manufacturers in our experience, and it's really hard to decide whether something is a legitimate problem that will impact consumers or should be dismissed because it's pre-production. Even when something reaches production, as I mentioned earlier, manufacturers often make updates, especially firmware updates, that might mean those problems that you found are completely irrelevant. So pre-production versus production cameras, or varying or differences in pre-production cameras, are a big reason that two reviewers might disagree. Another is manufacturer support. The purpose of these press events is to put the reviewers in proximity to the experts. So Nikon, Canon, Sony, we've been to all their press events, and they all have experts standing next to you. And when you say, hey, then this thing's not autofocusing properly for me, they can say, oh, well, let's try changing this setting. Let's try doing this instead. Let me get you a different lens because that lens might have a problem. They're able to troubleshoot things on the spot better than you could. Now imagine that there's a reviewer who did not attend the press event. They did not get the benefit of working side by side with the manufacturer. They might run into those problems and not have somebody there to fix them. They would publish those problems as being their own experiences. The reviewer that went to the press event and the reviewer that did not go to the press event both had similar experiences. They are both right. One had the tools they needed to actually solve the problem, and the other one didn't, and the problems ended up being surfaced. This is frequently an explanation for why two different reviewers can both be right and still publish different results. Another is loaners. Some people have noticed that we didn't publish reviews for recent launched cameras like the Fuji GFX 100 or the Nikon Z50 or any Pentax ever. And they accuse us of some kind of bias, like we're out to get these companies, so we're trying to just hide all that stuff. And it couldn't be further from the truth. In all of those cases, I reached out to the manufacturer to get a loaner, and they simply declined it. Now, this is a problem for me because, first, the way YouTube views work is I really need to get my review out early. If I don't get my review out either before the camera's release or very shortly thereafter, then the number of views I'll get for the review is very, very low, not enough to justify the massive amount of cost and time that I need to put into the video. And so I never made a review video about the Z50, and it wasn't because I hated Nikon, it was simply that they declined to give me that camera to review. Now, this is actually a bit of an ethical conundrum because they choose very carefully the reviewers who will get their equipment. And sort of an evolutionary process, they can decide the camera reviewers who might be more critical or might be more positive, and thus sort of dole out the loaners to those that are going to be more positive. And we've seen this get pretty dangerous, especially lately, where some camera manufacturers and drone manufacturers are very selective in who they hand the equipment to the extreme where every first review might be sponsored or endorsed in some way, and thus every first review is sort of glowing, and the only information you have to base your buying decisions on are basically advertisements. So manufacturers do sort of control these loaners to control the flow and timeliness of reviews, and I don't have a good answer for this. It sucks. By the way, in the case of Nikon, we are planning a review of the Z5, but we had to buy it out of pocket along with a couple of Z lenses so that we could give it a proper testing. And like, we're already underwater. Like, we've spent $3,000 or $4,000 like getting the equipment that we need. Plus we'll have to put the time into reviewing it because Nikon wouldn't loan us the gear. And I did this because I didn't simply want to skip another Nikon camera, because I actually think that's bad for Nikon. I want to give them a fair chance and a fair competition against the other cameras. They're kind of making it difficult for me, but I don't want to hold that against Nikon. Another common variation is in the way autofocus is measured. I frequently see people say autofocus is great, and what they'll do is they'll show the rear screen or they'll record the electronic viewfinder through, it's like a field recorder. And they'll show you the green box over the eye and say, wow, look, it's nailing the eye autofocus all the time. that doesn't actually determine whether or not it's nailing eye autofocus. You actually need to be taking pictures or capturing video and then carefully scrutinizing the final results. This, with the green box around the eye, does not equate to success. But that is a common conflict where we will measure the accuracy with individual pictures and extreme scrutiny, and other people are just looking to see if the box being drawn on the eye is quick. Another common problem is the difference between studio and real-world photography. This is something I personally struggle with too, because I do like to take controlled pictures in studio because it helps me eliminate all these other factors. I will, for example, test the 60 megapixel Sony a7R IV against the 24 megapixel Sony a7C on a tripod with very sharp lenses in photographing a subject that is a perfect two-dimensional plane. And I'll be able to say, hey, look, this 60 megapixel camera produces so much more detail than this other camera. But then you get out into the real world and you might not see any difference at all, because the real world has a whole bunch of variations in things like atmospheric conditions and exactly where the focusing point was. And of course, any three-dimensional subject is never entirely in focus since the focal plane is two-dimensional. So when you look at any sort of studio test, just take it with a grain of salt. Know that any studio test exaggerates the differences, while those differences are going to be diminished in any sort of real world test. I've also seen a big difference in language. Now, I know just about all the big reviewers personally. Like, I know all the DP review guys. Jared Polin is a friend of mine, Matt Granger. And there have been so many times when people have said, hey, Jared said this is good, you said it's bad. Why is that? DP review loved the Z6 autofocus, you hated it. Why is that? But a few days beforehand, I had been sitting next to those people and said, hey, I'm having problems with this autofocus system. Are you having the same problem? And they'll be like, yeah, we see the exact same results. So I know that we actually agree, but then other people interpret our results as being dramatically different. And if I go and I'll look at the reviews, it's often that we are guilty of using fairly harsh and almost fatalistic language. Like, I will say, the autofocus on this sucks. I called the R5 video quality the other day, I called it garbage because I was looking at it side by side and that's just what pops into my head. Other people are much more sensitive to the feelings of fanboys. I don't have that sensitivity. I just don't care. I don't know. So I tend to say things plainly. That's just my personality and my style. And other people will say, well, the Z6 autofocus was good, but you know, it didn't quite match that of some competitors in some situations. I'll just be like, yeah, I hated it. So we are conveying the same message, but doing it in different ways. It doesn't mean that we disagree. We both actually might 100% agree with each other. You're just hearing it differently. Other things like the lighting in a scene can be different. Backlit versus frontlit. You might be trying to film a black box versus a white box, and the white box is much more luminant, and thus it's going to look better than the darker box, or it might autofocus better because of the luminance of the subject. The scene might have different movement in it. The camera might be moving, or the subject might be moving forward or back versus a still subject. That's going to dramatically change how everything works. Different photographers have different styles. Their style might be far away with lots of depth of field, or it might be up close with shallow depth of field. That's going to change things. And we all have different experiences too. For example, I shoot lots of wildlife and sports. I'm used to using these like big, huge telephoto lenses and focusing on fast moving subjects. Not all photographers do that. Some are focused on portrait photography or landscape photography. We all have different amounts of experience, and we bring that with us when we do the review. Temperature can be a big difference too. Cameras tend to perform different under different temperatures, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. There's also a lot that gets left out when you record a review. Frequently, I've done this, especially in the early years. I would take 10 pictures and 8 of them would be out of focus, and I wouldn't say the autofocus on this camera sucks. Instead, I would show the in-focus pictures, and I would blame me for getting the other 8 out of focus. Now, maybe that's fair, maybe it's not. I talked to one reviewer who was reviewing a drone, and DJI had to send him like, I don't know, 8 drones or something before he got one that worked properly. Then he reviewed that properly functioning drone and never told the audience like, hey, we had 7 drones before that failed. Your odds of getting one that works are approximately 1 in 8. these things sometimes get left out of reviews. So one reviewer might surface those problems, the other might have experienced it and didn't surface it. Another frequent point of confusion is video versus stills autofocus. This came up with the recent A7C. We said the stills autofocus worked great and the video autofocus was a little bit flaky. And a lot of people said, well, how could this be? You said that autofocus is great and then you said the autofocus is bad. We're talking about like two different animals here. So you can see how people might be confused comparing completely different reviews when they do get confused in the course of a single review. Other things that can change how a camera performs are whether HDMI out is hooked up. You know, when you record the viewfinder so you can see the little box around the eye and you're using an external field recorder, turns out that actually taxes the camera much more than if you did not have that hooked up. Panasonic pointed this out to us. We were using an EVF and they said, okay, you can use the EVF, but it's not going to reflect what you normally see because as soon as you plug in that field recorder, the frame rate has to drop, and that means the entire autofocus system has to slow down. And so immediately I just stopped using the field recorder, but you will still see field recorders used a lot, but take those results with kind of a grain of salt because it might be degrading the entire performance of the camera. Different frame rates in video can make a difference. 24p might focus faster or slower than 30p or 60p. For example, Jordan over at DP Review, he always shoots in 24p. Me, whenever possible, I shoot in 60p. They are differences in style. But because we tend to prefer different camera settings, we might get different results. Card speeds can make a big difference too. If you're using an older, slower card, you might run into buffering problems or random failures. If you're using a high-speed card, you might not run into those things. And this is a new one, but battery life can actually change things too. We found this out with the R5. I didn't even know this, but we were getting a slow frame rate. Gordon figured out that if the R5 battery is below like 60%, the frame rate drops. Like, I worked with Canon, they never warned me about this, so I went out and tested it, and maybe my battery was below that point. Like, I don't know because I wasn't watching it because I've never thought I needed to make sure the battery was topped off before doing a test like that. Now I'm going to go through some real conflicts where you guys have written in the comments and said, hey, these reviewers say you're wrong. Most recently with the A7C review, Julia Trotti and Gerald Undone had more positive video autofocus results than we did. And I went back and watched both of their reviews. I totally 100% agree with them. You should watch the reviews. They are great reviewers. Their video autofocus tests were different than ours. They did a little bit of the holding a subject in front of the camera, just like we did. Gerald held up, I think, a white Rubik's Cube, and Julia held up her hand with fairly fair skin. I held up dark lenses that were black. Maybe that explains why theirs switched to the foreground subject faster than mine did, maybe because the subject I was holding up was dark. I don't know. It could be so many other things. It could be I was using a 24mm f1.4, the Sony lens, by the way, with very shallow depth of field. So differences in autofocus would be more apparent. They were using different lenses. That might explain it. I also used many more different scenarios. I was switching between a face and a static subject, and I was flipping the camera over to Chelsea, who was holding her smartphone here. All of our results are totally valid. And if you're interested in buying the camera, you should definitely watch all of those reviews and take into account how you might be shooting and which particular segments most closely reflect the types of things that you might be doing in the most extreme circumstances. You know, you need the camera to perform every day, but you also need to perform in the most extreme circumstances, because if you have that one time when you need to hold up something to the camera, you don't want to end up super frustrated with that and have it fail you and ruin the entire shoot, right? Going back a couple of years when we reviewed the Nikon Z6, one of the big problems we had is that the color was all over the place. The white balance was just terrible. It turns out when Nikon switched from DSLRs to mirrorless cameras, well, the white balance on a DSLR is handled in the metering system, which is off sensor. So they had to basically make an entirely new white balance system that was going to be on sensor. They were starting over from scratch, and it wasn't very good at the time. But literally no other reviewer complained about the white balance. We found some scenes were yellow and some scenes were blue, and it was just a mess. And when I talked to other reviewers about it after the fact, they said, we simply don't use auto white balance. We always do manual white balance. There, a difference in shooting styles explains the different results. The white balance is actually a problem. At least it was in that version of the camera. And if you're like me and you use auto white balance, then you're going to see that problem. If you're like them and you don't use auto white balance, then you won't see that problem. There's no need to take it personally. None of this is fatalistic. We didn't require you to buy it or prevent you from buying it. You should say to yourself, are the problems they're experiencing things that I'm going to experience also? Another problem was the Z6 auto exposure just wasn't good. That was another thing that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up when they switched from DSLRs to mirrorless cameras. Other people decided they simply did not use auto exposure at all. They did everything manual exposure, and thus they wouldn't have uncovered those problems. Why did we have problems with the Z6 autofocus and other people maybe didn't? Well, different shooting styles. A lot of portrait photographers, for example, will have a subject completely static. They'll use single autofocus and focus on the eye and kind of carefully compose it and snap it. Both Chelsea and I have much more dynamic portrait styles where we have the subjects move. We like a little bit of movement in there. We tend to use AFC, but we also tend to use telephoto lenses and shallow depth of field that are going to push that to the extreme. So we're putting more load on the camera than other photographers. So if they're putting less load on it, they're not running into the same problems that we are. Again, watch both reviews and you can say to yourself, well, I actually do use continuous AF a lot. I need that system. Or no, I can get by with the sort of slower manual focus or AFS system. I had a memory card fail on the EOS R, and a lot of people accuse me of like trying to sabotage Canon for some reason. Despite the fact that I was at a Canon press event, the card failed and I immediately showed it to a Canon engineer who was within 3 feet of me, and he took it to the other engineers in Japan. Like, this was not me being crazy. Some people don't care if a camera has only one memory card slot. And to me, that's like not caring if your car has a seatbelt or not, because after all, you've never been in a car accident. Me personally, I wear a seatbelt, even though I haven't been in a car accident, and I would not buy a car without one because I know that accidents do happen, and I know that it's not always user error. Some accidents can be out of your control. Same with memory cards. Memory cards do fail. We polled over 4,000 people, and about half of them had had a memory card failure where data was lost. And the more pictures people took, the more likely they were to have experienced some kind of failure. But like I said, people have had different experiences. Some people would feel crushed if their memory card failed. Other people would just be like, no big deal, the pictures aren't that important, or they would just be able to retake them. What about when he tested the Sony A9 Mark II? And we complained about electronic viewfinder lag when shooting with the 600mm lenses for both wildlife and sports. Other people didn't complain about this. Well, here I actually shoot wildlife and sports all the time. Those are the two things I shoot the most, and I usually do it with a DSLR. So I'm used to an optical viewfinder that has absolutely no lag. The other people I talked to did not regularly shoot wildlife and sports, so they wouldn't have had that same point of reference. I was trying to get close and time the soccer headers because I wanted that sort of split-second shot, and I was finding that really difficult with the little tiny amount of lag that it had. But other people weren't being quite so precise about it, so they would have had a different experience because they had different backgrounds. Our results are all valid. If you're not an intense sports and wildlife photographer accustomed to shooting DSLRs, then maybe the EVF lag wouldn't have been a big deal to you. Your results would probably feel more like the other reviewers who didn't regularly shoot it. But if your background is more like mine, then you probably would have had the same problems. Recently, every reviewer tried the A7S Mark III to see if it would overheat. We found it did not overheat. Dan Watson in Florida, a friend of mine, found it did overheat. I totally trust Dan Watson. I also trust my own results. I'm in Connecticut, he's in Florida. It could be that it was just hotter and thus it would overheat. These were all pre-production cameras, unbeknownst to me at the time, and it could be that things were not really tightened up properly and the heat was not properly transferring from the processors to the heat sinks. I don't know. But it's not that I disagree with him. All our results are valid. We're both right in all of these circumstances, and generally you can trust the reviewers. Another potential point of conflict is that YouTube actually pays us to fight against each other. You see this a lot. If you search for Tony Northrup at YouTube, you'll find a lot of videos like Tony Northrup is wrong, and then it will have my face in there in the thumbnail, and they'll be pointing at me like, ah. This happens because they can make money doing that. They're like reaction videos. When you post a video and it has keywords like the other YouTuber's name or the same keywords for the review that they're doing, people will be drawn to click on that video. And often these sort of reaction videos will get more views than our original video would. So they are financially motivated to do this. It's saying that somebody else is wrong is a great way to appear sort of smarter than that person and make a bunch of money at the time. So it's not likely to go away anytime soon because this is the structure of YouTube. But keep that in mind when you see somebody straight out saying somebody else is wrong. They almost certainly didn't reach out to try to resolve the conflicts ahead of time. That never happens. If that did happen, it has happened a few times where somebody reached out. We were always able to resolve it peacefully without having to make some big public conflict. All those public conflicts are generally manufactured. So my advice to you, watch several reviews and trust all of them because most reviewers are genuinely trustworthy and doing their best. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Don't assume that they're being biased or sponsored or lying to you or they're stupid. None of us are stupid. Recognize that the results are never black and white. This is never perfect. This is never a piece of trash. They're all shades of gray. How well does this work? Pretty well, not that well, good in some situations, not good in others. And go ahead and ask the YouTubers questions, either in YouTube comments or even send an email, and be polite about it. You don't have to say, oh, you're such an idiot because of this. You can say, I noticed you got different results than Gerald or Gordon or Jordan or Jared. What's up with that? Can you take a look at their video and see what might explain that? Be polite about it. It never hurts, right? My goal with this was to reduce the tension between different YouTubers because there's no need to pit us against each other. We're all trying to do something that we love. None of us got into this to get rich. We got into this because we love it. We love communicating. We love photography. We love maybe the art, maybe the science, maybe some combination of both, just like y'all, right? So there's no need for us to fight. We can all be polite about it. Generally, these differences can be totally explained. Let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are. And don't forget to subscribe. It's free. And you'll get to see lots more unsponsored, unbiased reviews. Thanks.